Hello and welcome to my presentation today titled Cooking for Sitting Bull, a Prussian Pioneer on America's Western Frontier. My name is Sharon Hudgins and I'm a lecturer on Viking ocean cruises. And as many of you know, Viking lecturers have come from a wide variety of backgrounds. I was a university professor for 20 years and I'm also a professional writer and written 5 books. And in 2006, I started working as a lecturer for National Geographic and Smithsonian on their tours, and in 2017, also working for Viking Ocean Cruises. And many of my lectures focus on the history, culture, and foods of the places that we visit. And I love working with Viking because the passengers, the guests on the ship, really seem to be interested in the places that we visit. And now that Viking is offering river cruises in America, we decided that you might enjoy hearing this story too of my great-grandmother who immigrated to America from Prussia in Europe in the 1860s and became a friend of the great Indian chief, Sioux Indian chief, Sitting Bull. Now, many of us grow up hearing stories about our ancestors. Some of those are just myths or legends. Some of them are wishful thinking on our part. And some of them are actually true. This story that I'm going to tell you today about my own ancestors is based as much as possible on recorded facts, in published records, in firsthand accounts, and in interviews with my great-grandmother nearly 100 years ago in the 1930s when she herself was 70 years old. So the story starts with the Dell family. George Martin Dell and Elizabeth, or known as Lizzie, Hallway Dell. They are the main characters in this story, and they were homesteaders in the Dakota Territory from 1883 to 1895. And the other main character in this story is Sitting Bull and the Lakota Sioux Indians. And he was a famous leader of the Lakota Sioux, born, we think, around 1831, and died in 1890. And Sitting Bull's name in the Lakota language is Tatanka Iyotanke. So Elizabeth Hallweg was born in Flatow, West Prussia in 1863, a small town in West Prussia. Her father Wilhelm was a master baker who had a large bakery there. Her mother Matilda apparently had 12 children, but only 5 lived to adulthood. They were ethnic Germans and members of the Lutheran Church, and this picture that you see here is the Lutheran Church in Flatow. And to give you an idea where Prussia was, where she was born, can you see up at the top of the map where it says the Baltic Sea? And then look just below that and you see Pomerania and West Prussia in the green area. And the village of Flatow was really just on the border between Pomerania and West Prussia on the West Prussian side. Now, what was Prussia? Prussia was one of the kingdoms in these Germanic lands that in 1871 were united to become the country of Germany itself. But at the time that Elizabeth was born and lived there, it was still the kingdom of Prussia in this northern part of what became Germany. This was a land of shifting borders in that area. And now, since 1945, since the end of World War II, the town of Flatow is located in Poland because Poland is in control of that territory now. And it is spelled and pronounced Złotów, as you see at the top of the screen. But the Hallwegs left a long time before that. They left in 1867 when Elizabeth was 4 years old. And they moved to New York City. They lived in New York City from 1867 to 1885. And the family story is that Matilda Hallweg, Elizabeth's mother, didn't like big city life. And she told her husband, Wilhelm, I want to homestead on a farm in Iowa. I want to go out there and claim land. And you can come with me if you want. And if you don't want, you can stay in New York. Well, he moved with her. And they homesteaded in Davis Corners, Iowa in 1875. And Davis Corners was a small, very small place in northern Iowa. They had a farm of 360 acres and built this house where the whole family lived. So that's one side of the story, my great-grandmother. My great-grandfather's side of the story were Quakers by the name of Dell, and they'd lived in America much, much longer than the Hallvegs did. The Dell family immigrated from England to America at the American colonies at the time in the late 1600s. And in 1844, George Dell, my great-grandfather, was born in New Jersey. The family was Quakers. He was raised as a Quaker, and later in life he became a farmer, worked as a lumberjack and a school teacher, and also as a rancher. But when he was 13 years old, the family moved from New Jersey to Iowa, where they too homesteaded on a farm beginning in 1857. During the last year of the Civil War, 1864 to 1865, George Dell joined an Illinois infantry regiment. He actually served in 2 regiments during that time period, possibly as a medic, we're not sure, but that's part of the family lore. And the same family story says that at the end of the American Civil War, he walked the 350 miles back to Iowa, where he resumed farming. Well, that was 1865. Sometime between 1875, when the Hallvegs moved out to Iowa, George Dell met Elizabeth Hallveg out there in Iowa, and she was a teenager. We don't know what time period they met, but they fell in love and decided to get married. And it's interesting because Elizabeth was only 1 month past her 20th birthday and 20 years old, and George was 39 years old. Both families opposed the marriage of these two. It was a first marriage for both of them. And this is what they said. Both families opposed the marriage. Elizabeth's Lutheran family didn't want her to marry, quote, a Yankee 20 years older than she is. And George's Quaker family didn't want him to marry, quote, that little German girl. But the marriage lasted 42 years. They had 6 children. She had several miscarriages. And 4 of those children, including their son John, my grandfather, survived to adulthood. So 3 days after their wedding, they packed up and got on a train and headed west to homestead in the Dakota Territory. And George had heard that money could be made in cattle ranching out there, and so that's why they decided to go for this opportunity. And the way they could get land out there was because of the U.S. Homestead Act of 1863. And it said that the head of a family who was a U.S. citizen could claim up to 160 acres of land, but they had to build a house on it, some kind of dwelling that they lived in within 6 months of claiming the land. They had to live on the land for 5 years and either farm it or raise cattle on it. And at the end of 5 years, they could purchase title to the land very cheaply, or they could even buy the land for more money in advance before the 5 years was up. Well, now think about it. Where did those lands come from that all these Western settlers, these white settlers, were moving out onto? They were the Indian lands, the lands that had been taken away from the Native Americans who already lived there, taken away by the U.S. government. So this map shows actually where the area where they moved to as homesteaders. The map shows North Dakota up at the top and South Dakota at the bottom. At the time they moved there, it was the Dakota Territory. It wasn't 2 states yet. They didn't become separate states of North and South Dakota until 1889. So when they moved out there in 1883, it was still the Dakota Territory. And if you look in the shaded part of the map, on the top left, the very corner there that's got the hatching on that corner, that's the area they moved to. And if you look slightly to the right, the much darker area says Standing Rock, and that is the Indian reservation that was the closest to them. Now, I don't know, I don't have any idea, none of us do, what George and Lizzie thought about buying land that had been taken away from the Indians, but I suspect that, like a lot of settlers, they thought of it as an economic opportunity for them. I don't know if they thought of it as a morally a moral problem, morally wrong to do, but they did in fact live a bit differently from some of the other settlers who were out there at the time. So what happened was, from Iowa, 3 days after their wedding, they took the train to the Dakota Territory, to the town of Kimball, which you see on this map. And they spent several months getting together the supplies and the cattle and the things that they needed for the homestead that they were going to build. And in the spring of 1884, they set off for the Cave Hills area up in the top left of the map that you'll see there, because that's where the land that George had claimed, that is the area where it was located. And so that they traveled in 2 covered wagons. It took them 4 months to get there, and they had 2 covered wagons. One of them was driven by George. The other was driven by Lizzie. They had 4 cowboys with them and a herd of Angus cattle. It took them the 4 months to travel those 400 miles to the Cave Hills, and Lizzie was already pregnant with their first child. And every time they stopped for a meal along the way, according to Lizzie, they unloaded a small iron stove from one of the covered wagons so she could cook for them. And for fuel, she had to go around and collect dried buffalo dung and dried cattle dung, because wood was impossible to find out there on the prairie. These are the 2 of the books that Elizabeth had with her. On the left is her Bible in German from 1863. And on the right is a cookbook in English that she had while she was living out there. In her records, it also says she has another cookbook, but this is the only one that the family has inherited. And she really enjoyed baking. She was known as a very good cook all of her life. She really enjoyed baking, and that's probably a skill that she learned from her father, the master baker Wilhelm. So Elizabeth said a typical midday meal on the trail consisted of the items you see up here: on homemade bread, fried bacon, canned tomatoes, coffee, and juice from canned tomatoes. They drank that if no water was available, because water was a big problem both for them and for the herd of cattle that they were taking out there to the Cave Hills area. And this is something else that she said. Every other night she also baked bread. Here's how she described it. When on the road, I sponged the yeast cake about noon and covered it in a kettle. When we stopped in the evening, I set the stove in the tent and mixed the dough stiff with flour before I went to bed, usually about midnight. I told the boys on the night shift, when the dough was so high later in the night, to call me, and I got up, washed, mixed it into loaves, went back to bed. Then I told the boys when it was light to call me to start the fire. That was about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Then I baked bread before we started on the trail. When bread was done and we finished breakfast, we scooped the fire out to cool off the stove so the boys could load it on planks on the back of the wagon again. And she did this every day or 2 for 4 months as they were traveling out there. This is a picture of her rolling pin, which one of the cowboys that was with them carved for her while they were on the trail. And this is really large. It's 22 inches long. After 4 months, they finally got to where they had homesteaded this land, made a claim for this land up in the Cave Hills area. And it's due west of the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, as I showed you on the map earlier. And one visitor there described it as a good place to make money, but a poor place for a civilized being. And this will give you an idea of what the land looked like that they homesteaded on. This is the prairie land, and this is a picture of the land from the house that they eventually built on it. The first Dell Ranch house then was built in 1884, just after they arrived there, and George immediately built one that looked like this. This is not a picture of their house, but it's one that's very similar. The cabin was 12 feet by 13 feet. It was 1 room. It had a dirt floor and a sod roof. And George, Elizabeth, and all 4 cowboys lived in that same room together, slept in that same room together. And Elizabeth, by the way, was the only white woman within 100 miles in any direction from where they were. The nearest doctor was 2 days away by horseback riding. And so that's probably why every time Elizabeth got ready to have a child, she went back to her family in Iowa and had her child there and then came back with the child again afterwards. Excuse me. So while Elizabeth was away having their first child in Iowa, George built their larger ranch house. So this is a picture of their actual house that he built starting in the winter of 1884 and on into the spring of 1885. Now this one had 3 rooms. There was a combination sitting room and kitchen in the middle and a bedroom on each side. There was a basement storage room for food and a separate bunkhouse for the cowboys and a separate smokehouse for preserving meat. And one visitor to their ranch described it as the largest and best ranch house in the whole region. And this is the house that Sitting Bull and the other Lakota Sioux visited while the Dells were living there. So as I said, Sitting Bull is the other character in this story. And the first time he came to the Dell Ranch was in the summer of 1886, when Elizabeth was back again in Iowa giving birth to her second child, John, who grew up to become my grandfather. Sitting Bull came with 4 men of his tribe, one of whom was an interpreter, and he came to George for help because he had sore eyes and none of the remedies that the Indians had were able to help him. So George treated him with one of his own homemade medicines, and then he fed all 5 Indians who had come. While Sitting Bull was there during that visit, he also sold George a peace pipe for $5, which was a lot of money back then. But then after that, every time Sitting Bull and the Indians came to visit, they and George sat down and smoked that peace pipe together, and it was their own personal ritual of friendship. This is a photograph that was made later that shows the peace pipe. That's George in the upper right-hand corner, and that's his first son, his second child, his first son, John, my grandfather, in the lower left-hand corner. So this is a photo of the Sioux getting their beef rations. And what is that all about? Well, when the Indians were moved off their land and onto reservations, they were supposed to plant crops to feed themselves. And those crops would be supplemented by government rations of beef, flour, and sugar. But the problem was the Sioux had been nomadic hunter-gatherers, and they weren't successful as farmers on the reservations. Also, the reservations were on not very good soil at all. And then the government cut their rations on the reservations too, for various reasons, and the Indians became more and more hungry. So to help solve this problem, the Indians were given permission to leave the reservation in the spring and the fall to hunt game on further lands away. But Sitting Bull actually went off the reservation even without permission. He sort of did what he wanted to do. And as the Indians traveled from the Standing Rock Reservation, they often came to the Cave Hills region where the Dells lived, and they camped on the creek in front of the Dells log cabin. And that became a routine stopping place for the hunting parties of the Indians because there was water available there. The Indians also learned, of course, that Elizabeth would feed them whenever they appeared. And this is according to what Lizzie said about the visits of the native Sioux that came to see them. They came in covered wagons, came into that country to hunt deer and antelope every year. When they came to the house, they always motioned to me in their mouth to eat. Fried bacon, cookies, cakes, etc. If there were more than 8 of them, they sat on the floor. One time Sitting Bull came with 6 men. He told me how women admired him. I fed the group of them, sat them to the table. They ate their pie, cake, and cookies first. Then they finished up on meat and potatoes. One Saturday, I made rice pudding for the next day for Sunday. George looked out of the window and said, "Your friends are coming." 3 wagons, then 3 more. Put on more potatoes, made bread and fried bacon, fed about 30 Indians that day. I fed the Indians every time they came. I never let one of them go by. George used to say, "Lizzie, Lizzie, don't you stop and think how far I have to haul that food?" And I'd say to him, "If you were downright hungry and in their place like that, Wouldn't you have a kind feeling for someone if they would feed you? And he'd laugh and say, you believe in the scriptures. Oh, what George was talking about was the food supplies that he had to bring to the ranch, because where they were living, they had their beef and they had some other foods, but nothing like the kinds of supplies that they actually needed to feed them and the 4 cowboys who worked for them. So 3 times a year, in May, July, and September, George traveled 100 miles north by buckboard, like this buckboard wagon in the photo, traveled by buckboard over the prairie to Dickinson in what is now North Dakota. And that was the nearest railhead to the ranch. And there he'd buy supplies for the ranch and bring them back. It was a 3-day trip each way in the buckboard wagon. And this is Dickinson, North Dakota's train station. In September, George and the cowboys also took the cattle up there, and that's where they shipped the cattle by train to markets in Chicago, and then bought supplies that were needed for the next 7 or 8 months on the ranch, because in the winter it wasn't possible to travel. And this is one of their shopping lists for the trip up to Dickinson. So you can see they needed flour, smoked bacon, coffee, sugar, raisins, currants, and dried apples for the kinds of baking that Lizzie did, cans of canned tomato and peaches, many cases of those. And they even got fresh lemons, which they kept in water and changed the water every few days, so they would keep the lemons for several weeks that way. Okay, the Dells also had access to the same kinds of wild foods that the Native Americans had always eaten in that region, such as deer, elk, antelope, wild sheep, rabbits, and geese. And Lizzie was good at smoking fresh meat to preserve it for several months. She said, quote, I used to take the hindquarter of deer and antelope meat and make a sugar cure brine and salt them down and then smoke the meat like I did beef on the farm. We had a smokehouse made of logs and plenty of good, hard, dry wood. And one of their visitors wrote later that it was the best smoked meat he had ever eaten. Lizzie also foraged for the same kinds of wild plants that the Native Americans ate up there too. And in one of the interviews with her, these were the things that she listed that they had available. They seldom had fresh vegetables, though. Lizzie had a small potato patch near the cabin, but the soil was really so bad that they weren't able to grow anything else there themselves. So it was just these wild plants, the potatoes she grew, and the kind of supplies they could bring 3 times a year from Dickinson. And this is what she described as a typical ranch breakfast: bacon, fried eggs if the hens laid, and baking powder biscuits or bread. For lunch, they would have beef in the winter and deer or antelope in season. And of course, sometimes they'd have, when they were running low on fresh meats, they would have the smoked meats that she had done. And a lot of canned tomatoes and peaches. And for dinner, they had potatoes from the patch near the cabin, more canned fruit, and the cake, cookies, or pie that she also baked. And of course, most of her baked goods needed eggs. This is another quote from Lizzie. The first year I bought a dozen chickens in Dickinson. We kept chickens, so we had eggs to bake with. The second year I couldn't bake cakes, no eggs. Later we got some more chickens, hatched a few chickens and then ate them, only kept a dozen chickens because we had to haul grain 100 miles from Dickinson to feed the chickens, and it just didn't pay for us to keep more of them. Well, these are some of the recipes that she passed down to her daughters and granddaughters, just for you to see. They really contain just the same kinds of basic ingredients that she had out on the ranch: flour, sugar, fat, eggs, and flavorings. Some examples of her recipes that are written down by her granddaughters from her. And here's a batch of the ginger cookies that were made by one of my cousins using one of Lizzie's recipes. And presumably, these were the same kinds of baked goods that she served to Sitting Bull and the Lakota people when they came to visit. Also, when the Indians camped nearby on the creek in front of their cabin, Lizzie took her 2 little sons down to the camp to play with the Indian children. And she said they weren't afraid of the Indian women, but were afraid and cried whenever they saw a white woman other than their mother, Lizzie, because they were used to being around the Indians, but except for their parents, they weren't used to being around other white people, except when they went back to Iowa to visit their grandparents, of course. Well, all the Dell children grew up bilingual in both English and German. They spoke English to their father, they spoke German with their mother, and surely they learned some words of Lakota too when they played with children like this. Lizzie also recalled that one evening when the Indians were camped on Bull Creek, the creek in front of their cabin, George told her that a child had been born there that afternoon and she should make coffee for the mother and also fruitcake. Again, I'm quoting Lizzie, took it to the new mother on Saturday and told them that I had made that for the squaw and the papoose. On Sunday morning, a young squaw brought me a hindquarter of deer and motioned that this was a reward for my kindness to the new mother before they broke camp and left that day. The Sioux also brought other gifts to the Dell family. According to Lizzie, every time they came, they brought moccasins. That's all I wore on my feet while she was out there, just the Indian moccasins that were brought to her. And this is an example of the Sioux moccasins. And when she would return to the ranch from Iowa from having her next child, then after she'd had the new baby, the Sioux would show up, the Sioux women would show up and bring her tiny moccasins for the new child also. And one summer they came with moccasins after her young son Charlie had died. And according to Lizzie, quote, when I motioned where he was in heaven, they wouldn't give the moccasins to me because they found out he was dead. And she assumed that they had some kind of superstition about giving a gift for a deceased person. This is a gift from Sitting Bull to my great-grandfather, George. He gave this knife to him sometime in the late 1880s. It's obviously not a trade item made by Native Americans themselves. It's one they got in trade from people that were farther east of that. But it looks kind of like a boning knife or for removing sinews, taking sinews out of an animal carcass. And another gift they received from Sitting Bull was this, a signed photo of him himself. And Lizzie recounted a special event in the summer of 1889 when Sitting Bull gave her this photo. I quote again, Sitting Bull came up to the cabin with an interpreter, held the picture in his hand while the interpreter told me Sitting Bull was giving it to me because I'd been so kind to his people and had fed his tribe whenever they came. But I had to give him a picture of myself with the 3 children taken in Iowa because he wanted to hang it up in the Indian Agency at Standing Rock to show his braves who I was. Then he kissed me and told me via the interpreter that the women in Washington wanted him to kiss him and that I should consider it an honor. And after that, George always kidded her about being kissed by Sitting Bull. This is a picture of the Standing Rock Reservation where the Sioux were confined, and it's about now 120 miles east of the Dell Ranch. And this is where Sitting Bull's life ended. In the autumn of 1890, by the autumn of 1890, there were several groups of Indians in the Dakotas that were becoming very agitated. It's a complicated story, but they were tired of the way they'd been treated on the reservations. They were upset at the government for cutting their beef rations, and some of them began performing a ritual called the ghost dance. And it was a ritual that Sitting Bull also supported. And by doing this dance, they believed that they would reunite the living Native Americans with the spirits of their dead ancestors, that the westward expansion of the white people would end, the Native Americans would be unified again and bring peace and prosperity to their lives. So when this was going on, and it was a ritual dance, the Indians were getting more and more upset about what was happening to them. And the U.S. government and many of the settlers out there saw this as the beginning of an uprising, a kind of resistance by the Indians, a threat to the settlers and to the government forces that were out there too. This is a photo of the dance being performed at one of the reservations in South Dakota in 1890. And several of the ranchers up in the Cave Hills area where the Dells lived were concerned about the possibility of conflict with those Indians who seemed to be, as they put it, quote, on the warpath. Well, what had happened with the Dells was Elizabeth had had a miscarriage that summer of 1890, and her health wasn't very good. And she wanted to take her 4-year-old son, John, back to Iowa for the winter. But everyone at the ranch and the people that they knew up there urged her not to make that 3-day, 100-mile trip over the prairie up to Dickinson to where she could get the train to go back to Iowa, because it was too dangerous to cross the reservation. It was too dangerous, and she had little or no chance of surviving an Indian attack. But she was a strong-willed woman, and she was adamant about going. So in the autumn of 1890, she, George, and their little son, John, set off in their buckboard going north. And it was a 3-day trip, as I said, 100 miles. And very early on in the journey, they noticed an Indian scout following them. He never made contact with them, always stayed where he could see them, but stayed in the background and followed them the entire time until Elizabeth boarded the train. And the Dells firmly believed that Sitting Bull had provided that safe escort across the prairie. As Lizzie later said, quote, "Crossed the reservation once and everybody said we'd never get across alive. No harm came to us as we had an escort in the distance." And since my grandfather, John Dell, was a little 4-year-old boy in that buckboard, I have Sitting Bull and the Lakota Sioux to thank for that protection, and which is how I'm able to be here today as his granddaughter and tell you that story. In December of 1890, during all this unrest, Sitting Bull was killed by Indian Agency police at the Standing Rock Reservation. It happened when they tried to arrest him. A lot of shots were fired. Sitting Bull was killed. And 2 weeks later, the very infamous Wounded Knee Massacre occurred near the Pine Ridge Reservation, which was south of there. And they killed nearly 300 Lakota Sioux, including women and children. And the Wounded Knee Massacre was one of the last military actions against Native Americans on the Northern Plains. But despite what had happened to them, actually the Sioux maintained their friendship with the Dells. It continued until the Dells finally gave up ranching there in that area in the mid-1890s. The Indians came still to visit the ranch. Lizzie still fed them, and they still brought moccasins to her and the children. But for the Dells, it was an end of an era. In 1984, Elizabeth decided that she needed to, because of her health, to stay back in Iowa with her family. Ranching had no longer become profitable for the Dells. They'd lost a lot of cattle because of droughts in the summer, blizzards in the winter, wolves taking down their cattle. And so they decided that they were going to end their episode of their life as ranchers and move back to Iowa. So Elizabeth went back in 1894, and George just stayed until 1895 till he could sell the land and the cattle, and then moved back to Iowa. And this is a house that he built in 1897 for them on the farm that he still owns back in Iowa. That is Lizzie on the left-hand side of the photo. On the right-hand side, the woman is her mother, Matilda, and the little boy in the picture is my grandfather, John. This is a picture of Elizabeth Dell many, many years later in the 1930s with 2 of her grandchildren. And even though they had left the Dakota Territory after being there more than 10 years, George and Lizzie always had fond memories of their relationship with Sitting Bull and with the Sioux Indians there. And they passed down these stories to their descendants, as you've heard today. So I certainly grew up hearing these. George Dell passed away in 1925 when he was 81 years old. Elizabeth herself lived nearly 20 years later. She lived till 1945, just 2 months short of her 82nd birthday. She'd been born in Prussia before the automobile was invented, and she died in America after the atomic age had begun. So she saw a lot in her long lifetime. And later, George and Lizzie's youngest daughter, Ellen, wrote about her parents many years after they were gone. Quote, "They had great courage and a compassionate understanding of human relationships." I'd like to add a few postscripts to this story. This is about what happened to Sitting Bull's peace pipe. It was inherited by John Dell, my grandfather, who was George and Elizabeth's oldest son. And then later, when John passed away, his eldest son, Robert, inherited the peace pipe. In 1965, Robert sent the peace pipe around to all of his siblings who lived in different parts of the United States, one of whom was my mother. So it's a picture of my mother holding Sitting Bull's peace pipe, which I got to do too back in 1965. And then eventually Robert donated the pipe to the University of California at Northridge in 1988. That was his alma mater. But unfortunately, the pipe was destroyed in the California earthquake of 1994, when the building that it was in at the University of California collapsed entirely and the peace pipe was gone. The knife and the photo that Sitting Bull gave to George and Lizzie were inherited by other members of the family who still have them. Sometime in the 1930s, George and Elizabeth's youngest daughter, Ellen, who had been born in 1900, wrote a poem about her friendship, her parents' friendship with Sitting Bull. And no one saw it until her own daughter discovered the poem in Ellen's papers after she died in 1987. And I'd like to read to you the conclusion to her poem, which is in reference to George and Elizabeth and their friendship with Sitting Bull. "My sons played in your camp, listening to tales your mother gave you, the songs of your tribe, weird chants and haunting melodies lulled them to sleep. Tonight I will pray that in adulthood they remember a chief championing his people in the face of continued adversity and uncompromising hostility. May they recall and say, 'Thus died Tatanka Iotanke, Sitting Bull, the medicine man of the Sioux.'" And I'd like to conclude with a quotation from Iron Teeth, a Northern Cheyenne woman who lived out there in the Northern Plains at the same time that the Dells did and Sitting Bull did. According to Iron Teeth, quote, "I used to hate all white people, especially their soldiers, but my heart has become changed to softer feelings. Some of the white people are good, maybe as good as Indians." I also want to thank the members of the Dell family who provided a lot of information for this presentation. And the Dell story has actually been published in several places. In the 1938 edition of the South Dakota Historical Collections, in a book called An Autobiography of a Cowman by W.H. Hamilton, who lived out there and knew them and provided a firsthand account about what ranch life was like and about the Dells living there. And later on, 2 books were published by my own cousins who are direct descendants of George and Elizabeth Dell, Homesteading in South Dakota and Our Friend Sitting Bull. And both of these books contain a lot more details about their life in the Dakota Territory at that time. Images came from these places. And finally, I just want to say that I'm glad my ancestors had such a good relationship with their Native American neighbors and passed down those stories of tolerance and compassion to all of their descendants today. Thank you.